Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Our guest today is the only writer of detective fiction I can think of who has a master's in theology, who has worked in the book manufacturing business, and is a former motorcycle rider and sports car driver. I spoke to him back in January about his previous novel, Love, Pride, and Murder, featuring a very different kind of detective, T.B. Stone. His latest work is Of Towers and Shadows, which also features the anything but hard-boiled detective Thomas Bradley Stone, and we are very pleased to welcome back Dennis Feece.
How you doing, Roger?
Good. Before we dive into Of Towers and Shadows, I got a quote that might be appropriate. This is from a blogger, goes by the handle of Joe Blogs, who writes, detective fiction is about the corruptions of the human heart, the painstaking search for truth, and the complicated relationship between justice and the law. Almost invariably, therefore, even the most formulaic detective story has something to say to this theologian. For some reason, I thought of you when I read that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that go over that again. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. Basically, it says detective fiction is about the corruptions of the human heart, the painstaking search for truth, and the complicated relationship between justice and the law. Almost inevitably, therefore, even the most formulaic detective story has something to say to the theologian. And I was just curious how your theology degree intersects with your work.
Uh, okay, well, the last time we talked, I think I mentioned that having a theology degree is doesn't really lend itself to writing detective fiction necessarily, but there may be something in the background. Anyone that seeks a theology degree, at least a master's, a graduate degree of some kind, if you go on for a doctorate, then that means that you want to be in that field and you want to write and you want to create something that's new. That's generally what, or teach, one of the two. With a master's, you're sort of like in the foothills of all that, and so you can go forward, and then do your doctorate, which I thought about doing, but for different reasons I didn't. Or you can sort of sit on it, and all these ways of looking at the world tend to enter into things at the oddest times, and so you sort of learn to live with that. Sort of like having carbuncles. But the way it's worked for me is that, well, at the last little interview that we did, you had mentioned some comments I made in the novel about philosophy
Mhm.
and even some theologians, Kierkegaard, I think it was. And that's true, and that was in the novel. And there's a little bit of that in the second one. But in terms of filling that formula, that what was the gentleman's name who wrote that piece?
His name was a blogger by Joe Blogs.
Okay, so
Okay.
anonymous guy.
Yeah.
Uh, well, theologians tend to be anonymous. I think that's just sort of, at least at my level.
It's
You
hard to
know,
pick up chicks at parties saying you're a theologian. I don't know.
well, it depends on the party. Um, there's a perverse nature to theologians too. So, uh, yeah, that I think that in my case, if I thinking about the moral side, you mentioned morality as being touched upon, and he also talked about the trying to parse between good and evil, and at least between justice and injustice, I guess, to some extent. And without that in a detective novel, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anything that was interesting other than just the obvious stuff. So he's right about that. Um, in terms of understanding how those dynamics sort of interact, because they're sort of different approaches to the same end goal. I think if I'm understanding it, that's there's certainly nothing conscious, you know, but maybe the way your thinking is shaped by pursuing studies in theology, maybe that has a sort of implicit way of affecting what you write. I don't know. You tell me. I wrote it. I didn't do it consciously. If I managed to fill his what he's writing, but you read it. So what do you think?
I think there's some stuff in there. It's not stop preach, go back to the story. No, I think it's kind of interwoven in the nature of the characters themselves. I was reading the book and I was just having such a great time with it. Why am I enjoying this novel so much? And I realized I would love to meet these characters. I'd love to hang with them, go have a beer, talk philosophy, whatever. These are comfortable characters. They talk about the cozy school. This is not the cozy school, but they're cozy characters in this.
I see. Okay, well, that's good. I mean, to the extent that I was trying to create the characters so that they were um, real. And if you spend time with boring people, or you spend time with people that you really don't care for because of the circumstances, sometimes that happens in life. Fortunately, I'm pretty easygoing, so I find very few people like that. But occasionally, you'll stumble across someone, and if you're a kind person, if you're maybe a charitable person, you can draw out of that person as you know what you can, and sometimes it's surprising what you can draw out. So when writing my characters, you mentioned that you would like to spend time with them. They you really enjoyed the way certainly the way they were written. Um, have you known people like that in life? Any of
I've
those
known a
people?
few. I was going to ask you that question, assuming that maybe you had taken something from your friends or relations.
Not consciously, no.
Yeah.
The closest would be Lucia. Um, the I think for most of us, most men anyway, and boys, and from the time you begin recognizing that the other sex is really pretty nice and kind of fun, and you want to know more about it, to the time when you're my age and you're looking back more than you're looking forward at those kinds of experiences. Um, you I think for most men, women tend to be a little bit of a mystery, and that sounds really cliche, I know, but it's still true. And I think some cliches, at least most cliches, probably are based on something that's real. Um, the character of Lucia is an amalgam of ladies that I've known, and if I had to describe her in a way that would make that comprehensible to someone who didn't know all those women that I've known over the years, and, you know, God forbid you ever did, but I think she is probably the ideal woman that would fit, uh, not just me necessarily, although it's a big part of that, but that would fit TB, because TB isn't me. TB is a character that,
Mhm.
and maybe an alter ego, maybe to the extent that even that is possible. But I tried to draw her in such a way that she would balance TB. Okay, so if he could pick an ideal woman without realizing that he was doing it, he just encountered somebody and then suddenly everything seemed to mesh. That would be Lucia. And conversely, I think that to the extent that a man ever understands a woman, I think that he fits her requirements as well without even knowing it. And then you got something.
We should
So that's
explain that they met in the first book and have become very close by the second book here. Um,
right.
we talked a little bit last time about the difference between the hard-boiled
Yeah.
Raymond Chandler, the Phil Marlowe School of the 30s, and the cozy detective mysteries with somebody who isn't really a detective. You think of Murder, She Wrote or something like that. And you wanted to steer consciously in between those. I'm curious, and I suspect it's true, that it was a lot easier to write the second book because you had a course set in mind.
That's true. That's that. In fact, I assume you just finished reading the second
Yes.
installment of characters, and the plot is a little more intricate. The action is a little more substantial. The bad guys are a little more pronounced. I mean, all of that. The first novel was really directed at developing the characters. That's what I was trying to do, and I had in mind writing more than one. So if I'd been writing a novel that was intended to be a one-off, probably wouldn't have been a detective novel or anything like it. Something different. Um, but that's what I was doing. And I was thinking of writing a series, as I mentioned last time, when uh, when I wrote the first one. So I wanted to make sure that the characters were realistic. That was important, not just a cardboard cutout of what the private eye is supposed to be, but were real, that lived in a real place, had real life experiences, and looked at life in a particular way that people could identify with. I think that there's a sense of mystery about some of the characters as well. Like the backstory for TB still isn't completely revealed in the second novel. More of it for sure, but you see a side of him that you didn't see in the first one. I think that's what I was trying to do. I don't know. Did that come out?
Yeah. We introduce characters, now put them in a situation where they start reacting and revealing more about themselves as it goes, obviously. Um, I have to note these fun little Easter eggs. There's a place early on when TB asks Lucia to help him on the case, and she says, I can be Nora, you can be Nick, I like it, which of course is a reference to Nick and Nora Charles as the Thin Man, which is a lot of fun in there for those people who get it. Others will just kind of go by them, but it's fun.
Yeah, that's the Thin Man. Do you remember? Are you a television buff of any kind? I mean, from way back.
I was for many years. I gave it up after the ending of Lost, but yeah,
Such a disappointment that you just couldn't face anything anymore.
7 freaking years, and I expected a pretty damn big rabbit to come out of a pretty damn big hat at the end, and it didn't happen. So there you go.
That's a topic for a different discussion, but I had the exact opposite
Oh,
reaction to it.
okay.
Really did, and maybe I was just projecting into it, but I thought that it fit. So again, that's for a different time,
Yeah.
but you were pursuing at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you remember there used to be a television series called The Thin Man.
Mhm.
It was oh, what was the name? It was the guy who played Nick was one of Frank Sinatra's buddies, the Rat Pack. What was his?
I know it wasn't Sammy Davis. So,
No. Well, I can't think of his name. Anyway, the characters, the dog Asta, I can remember Asta's name.
yeah. That was a Peter Lawford.
Peter Law, yeah, Peter Lawford. That's who. Very good, excellent. So it was, and he always had that sort of, calm, collected, laissez-faire kind of approach to life. And she was a bit more. Her name was Phyllis. Her real name was Phyllis something. But Nora was, reflected off of him, and it made it fun. Now I was watching it as a very young kid. I mean, very young, um, 9, 10. I don't know how old I was back then, but I watched it every week in black and white,
Yeah.
And I loved it. And because of that, I started looking for anything that had the two of them involved. And the movies are still great. In fact, I have a DVD collection of all of the movies that were made. And now I'm Roy. I didn't know we were going to talk about this. Otherwise, I would have boned up on my Nick and Nora info. At any rate, those movies are infinitely better than the television.
Oh, no question. Yeah. But the budget was infinitely bigger too, and they had more time to shoot each one of them.
They were filmed in the 40s, and I think or maybe early 50s, but I think most of them were in the 40s.
Yeah.
So the life was a little different then as well. And it was, on television, things had to be really homogenized before, first pasteurized and then homogenized before people could accept them. The censors were bad. But in the movies, they got by with double entendres. They got by with all sorts of things that were fun and made it entertaining beyond just the plots and the scripts and whatnot, the dialogue. But they were great. And then, of course, the next step in seeking it out was to go to Dashiell Hammett and start reading Nora, which was really good. Within that, yeah, that was great. So for me, that's a real part of my life historically. So getting that into now, what I was thinking when I wrote that was not so much the Easter egg side of it, that you were talking about, but more the idea that Lucia had latched onto something that would give her an identity and she was, with tongue in cheek, she was presenting that to TB, and then that scene in the book has a conclusion that is sort of gives you an idea of what the two of them are all about in their playful way, and it all fits with the Thin Man. I think it sort of created and his reaction to it was, he's tolerating it, but not, I mean, tolerating the Thin Man thing, the Nick and North, because he's been reluctant to get her involved in that. But did you sense that he really wasn't reluctant? He wanted to get her involved in it, but he didn't necessarily let her know he wanted her to be involved in it. Does that make sense? I tried to get
sense, because I thought of it as him wanting to get her involved, but not feeling protective, thinking he shouldn't get her involved for that reason. But this is tug of war back and forth.
There you go. That's exactly what it is. The protective thing that then later comes out, big time.
I also want to mention another influence that you slide in there, and that's Casablanca.
Yeah.
And again, possibly the most perfect film ever made, but extraordinary work, and the fact that she sees it for the first time and is enthralled, brings us along with her. So yeah.
Way that everybody else has been before her. Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's the most perfect movie ever made. Best movie made in this country anyway. And I don't think anything has ever topped it. Nothing has ever come close to it. And the interesting thing is, and if you know anything about the story, about the history of the story, it was really just a wartime film. It was meant to be a propaganda film, cranked out like all the other movies that came out during those days. And that was really the sole purpose. It almost was an accident creating it that well. But it was. I mean, it was perfect.
Oh,
Sometimes
that they were working on the script before they started shooting. They didn't have the ending even, and that we're doing it daily. And this is kind of reminiscent of the way that they slapped together those Liberty ships, just working around the clock, just in time delivery kind of thing.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly so. Yeah. So they were a reflection of what it was, obviously a reflection of the time, but I think that it speaks to every classical, whether it's a book or an opera or whatever the creative piece is. It says something, and it does something that no one ever intended, and it has so much to do. Movies are a little different than looking at a sculpture, or looking at a painting, or even listening to a piece of music. You're sort of expected to project something into it. That's part of what the artist is doing. Movie isn't necessarily that way, and yet that's what happened with Casablanca for sure.
Yeah.
And the fact is, almost like a Jungian, collective way of looking at it. It digs into something that's so deep within the human psyche that it speaks to everyone. I mean, it's just that kind of a film. I've never known anyone who watched it that didn't fall in love with it. Never did. It's just sometimes they'll pick another movie as their favorite for whatever reason, but it's always in the top 5 or the top 2 or whatever, and usually number 1.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to bounce around a little bit and check another cultural icon, excuse me, and that is the incomparable Etta James, who's the only one that was mentioned in both books so far. I'm keeping score. And I have to say, for some of us she was a little before the time that I was paying attention, and I got introduced to her in Northern Exposure, the television show that played all sorts of background music. First time I heard At Last, I just was blown away. So, yeah.
Yeah, have you listened to her work since? I mean, not just The Last, but
yeah,
she had a voice, and she had a way of presenting, because she understood the songs, and she would a little bit like Billie Holiday before her. She interpreted. She didn't just sing; she interpreted, and just in such a soulful way, such a beautiful way. And that song, the idea of searching and never finding and being disappointed, and it all comes out in that song. And suddenly, at last, and that the whole idea of those two coming together and finding each other, that was that was exactly what I was trying to do in the novel, in the first one. And then in the second one, it's realized. And that song is that does it. Yeah. What else could you use?
Yeah,
That would
yeah.
just
I can't think of anything else about that. I want to talk a little bit about TB, which has kind of an unusual way of using his imagination for solutions. And several times in the books, he has an episode where he steps away from the world around him for a moment. And this is a fascinating time. Tell us about how that came to you.
oh wow, that's good. I was looking for, and I think I mentioned this the last time. I was looking for something that made him unique. I mean, you know, everyone has hidden talents that sometimes they find and sometimes they don't, but they're always there. And to the extent that they understand them, they can use them. They can, make it part of their repertoire, I guess. And for TB, he had this, obviously he's a very empathic kind of person. Empathy for him is part of what he does. And when he got it in his the backstory of the character, that's exploited in a way that ultimately made him uncomfortable, exploited by others in a way that made him uncomfortable. And then that's how the resolution was made for a certain part of his life. And I don't want to describe it because there are a lot of people that may read the first one because they're not going to get it in the second one to the extent that they did in the first one. So I don't want to give it away completely, but that was how it sort of became more than just intuition. Up to that point in time, he was younger, and he would get into situations where he could use his imagination more fully. It was blended with his intuition, and it made things more interesting. And he and his friend Ben talked about that and understood it. And it seemed a little odd to Ben at that time, but he understood it and recognized it for what it was. Later, as it became honed, it became a tool. And so, almost like going into the phone booth and changing with a cape, getting a cape and taking off and using his version of a superpower. Now, clearly, it's something that anyone who has an imagination and anyone who is open to developing their subconscious, because I mean that's something that Jung said everyone needs to do to be a full person, a complete person. Um, could appreciate. It's Superman is a little, not everyone's from Krypton, but TB is just a regular guy who has this empathic capability that a lot of people have, but they don't develop it. And in his case, he did develop it and had it developed for him at a certain point in his life. So that's really it. And it gives him an edge when he's investigating anything. It gives him an edge when he has to understand what other people are thinking and doing. And it gives him an edge when he can predict, when he has to predict something, or should predict something in order to, you know, happen. So I don't know, is that an explanation that makes sense?
Yes, perfect. Absolutely. That's just what I was hoping for. And I want to say, without giving anyone any spoilers, I have to walk a little bit carefully here. Things as we go through the book are proceeding comfortably with what I like to call a detective procedural. When something happens, it shifts the whole tone of the book. And without going into what that is, was that intended as a bit of a wake-up call?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly what it was. It was if you remember last time I said that the second one was a little darker than the first one.
Mhm.
I think it was an understatement. It's a lot darker than the first one. And in order to, it was a shift. It was and you notice during the book, it was almost halfway through the book, not quite, but almost halfway through the book at that point. And then there's a transition between the occurrence of that, and then when the detection, I guess, for want of a better word, begins again. So there's a little bit of a bridge there. And the bridge does a couple of things. First of all, it defines what's going to happen in the next half of the book pretty well. And it also um, I think it wraps up the first part of it and makes the first part of it almost like another story
Mhm.
in many ways. And that's what I was intending to do. It was almost like uh, how can I put it? There's almost a loss of innocence in terms of the characters. In the beginning, everything is, they have a challenge. They have, as you said, it's a perfect kind of detective procedural, but and entertaining, I think, and it uses the characters' strengths and weaknesses and all the rest of it, and especially Lucia and TB get together in a much closer way. And there are a lot of things that happen in it that ties up some of the threads from the last novel. But that wasn't the story. The story was what happens in the second piece. And that is what that's TB at his worst and at his best. And the TB coin has those two sides always prominent. You saw a little bit of that in the first one on the ball field. Remember that?
Yep.
That was always there. And he felt so bad about what happened that it changed his life, changed the course of his life when he was a kid, when he was an adolescent, through the help of some friends. And really, in the first novel, you never saw that side of him again. It was almost like he had matured, he had grown to the point where that wasn't anything that had anything to do with him. And even when you're explaining, or when I was explaining the reason for leaving the service early, although not really early, more like it wasn't something he wanted to continue doing, so he just left. Even that sort of, I think, underlined the fact that he had changed, that he was not the kind of person that could easily, or that could be that other side of the coin. Again, I don't want to get too explicit.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was a transition. So in the first part of it, you saw the best side of TB and Lucia together, and that wasn't accidental. I mean, that's why, part of the reason why you saw the good side of TB. The second half of it, you saw the worst side of TB, and yet it didn't go that far. I mean, he's a complicated character, and he has a lot of issues. Did you catch the scene where it's later, almost at the end of the novel, and he talks about, he's questioning. I won't give away why, but he's questioning his relationship with Lucia, right? Remember that? And he says to himself, he's talking to himself, that she had absolutely no reservations with the situation, but he did, and he had no idea why. And so he decided he was just going to bury it. And he said, and I have a deep, dark hole where I bury all of these things. And contrary to popular opinion, I'm paraphrasing, but contrary to popular opinion, there's nothing wrong with that. I know, because that deep, dark hole is filled with all kinds of shit. And he says, and I just right on going. It's written better in the book, but the point is that it's still there. He still has that side of him, and it's never going to go away. And he knows it, but he's got it under complete control, and he's allowed himself, in extraordinary circumstances, to tap into some of that if he needs it. Does that fit?
Absolutely. Again, I was just bouncing around from subject to subject because my notes are chaotic as usual. One of the things I like is you have very nice descriptions of meals that make me hungry every time I read the description on the page. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's I like to eat. So, I mean, I love food. And for me, if that mythical island ever presents itself to me and I'm stranded there, and I can have one kind of cuisine, it would be Italian without question. So that's just people talk about French cuisine. I've had French in a French restaurant. I've had, there used to be you're on the West Coast, but if you go down towards, I used to live in Lancaster, PA, which probably don't know anything about, but it's in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania. And for work, I used to go into Philly, frequently. But when my third wife and I were getting to know each other, and then shortly after we were married, before the kids came along, we used to do the restaurants. just tons of restaurants in that part of Pennsylvania. But as you go towards Philly, they become more sophisticated and more expensive and more interesting. And there was a French restaurant in French cuisine. Menu was in French. It'd been there forever, right off of Route 1, which is the old road that goes into Philly from Langston. Almost within, well, within like 20 minutes of Philly. And we went there frequently. Good wine list, and the food was great. Okay, food was great. But if I could have Southern Italian, in some authentic place, I wish to God I could go to Italy. I can't now, but I wish I could and go into some of the restaurants. I watch on YouTube. I watch these. I don't know what they're called, but they're like vlogs, I guess. People that tour the restaurants in Italy, and visit some of the places that people like me would love to visit, and I can dream. And when they eat, they sit down, and the food that they bring out, it's just, I wish I could capture some of it in writing, but I'm not that good.
Well, it worked enough to make me hungry. Of course, I'm a low bridge in that respect. So, um, when there's a there's a chapter in that he says, after being with each other for almost a year, we'd settle into a comfortable, intertwined pattern, respecting each other's moods and foibles, and we were happy. And I said to myself out loud, don't say that. That's like walking into the cellar without turning the light on in a slasher movie. Don't paint
Are
a
you,
target on your back.
you Irish? Are you Irish descent?
No, I'm not actually. English mostly.
English. Okay. Well, you probably have some Irish in your background somewhere, because that's exactly what an Irishman would say. That's that kind of superstitious stuff. Nah, I don't buy any of that. I don't. I understand what you're saying, but
Mhm.
I certainly have had, been situations I've been in where you a relationship seemed to get, just turn on a dime, and it went from good to bad, and could never quite figure it out. It would be me, or it could be her. It just depended on the situation. But I don't think. I think that, again, remember that first of all, it's fiction, so take it for that. But secondly, the idea was that she is his ideal and he is her ideal. That's the way I created them. And the whole, all what he was doing was acknowledging it. He was recognizing it, and he was sort of baffled by why, and he didn't really want to explore it. He just accepted it.
I want to take a look at the future now because when we talked in January, you had this book at the publisher. I'm assuming that there's another one finished, partly finished.
No, it's not. It's maybe a third of the way through.
Okay.
It's going to be well, it depends, but my plan is for it to be the third, and then it would be the last in that group. It, Again, if people start reading these things in such a way that you know I kind of have to keep writing, then I can do that. I think the characters are, once people read the characters, they all seem to have the same kind of reaction that you have to them, and that's gratifying. And if the stories are, if they track well enough, that they're entertaining, and they read like a mystery, and have the characteristics of mystery, and people are sort of drawn to them, then there's going to be more reading and more books and whatever. But if that doesn't happen, then that's okay too. I will finish off the series with the third one. It'll be a trilogy rather than a series.
What do you hope that they take away from it when they close the book?
The second one,
Yeah.
or the trilogy?
Or the
The
whole
second.
thing, actually.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the Towers and Shadows.
Yeah.
Uh, you're in a unique position because it's just been released. Not a lot of people have read it, and even the people I've shared the book with a couple of people that I know, but I haven't gotten feedback yet. So it's new. It's all just new. In fact, I just got my advanced copies uh, 3 weeks ago.
Well,
So I mean, it's really, and the electronic version of it hasn't been released yet. So and it'll be coming soon. Um, so I haven't got a lot of feedback on it, but you've read it, and you just read it, so I'm assuming you have a sense of the I don't want to overstate it, but the afterword in the first and the afterword in the second have a way of shining a certain light on,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously that's the intention, but I think it does, and I think it may alter the way you have perceived the novel coming up to that point. So with that in mind, what would you say the the takeaway would be? And I give you license to just describe it.
The takeaway is that things can happen that disrupt even the happiest times, but perseverance, trust in each other, love, honor, obey, all that good stuff will out in the end, is my thought.
Okay, that's good.
And
Yeah, that's good. And the actual ending of it is where that came from, I think. Right?
yes, indeed. And I will say that it's possible to think of that as the ending for a duology, if you will, but I want more from you, dang it. So get busy on that.
Okay, good. Well, that's easy to do. And the third one is oh, maybe I don't know how many pages it's going to be, but I'm guessing they're about the same as the other two. Somewhere between 250 and 300 pages, and just about a third through it. So it's going slower than the first two, and the reason for it is, there are a lot of reasons for it. Life sometimes gets in the way of
We were talking about the afterword. Tell us a little bit more about that.
the afterword. Yeah, the afterword has been designed to, in both cases, to summarize where the novel is at that point in time. So, you come to the ending of the novel, there's a satisfying ending, and then the afterward uh, draws something out of that particular novel, both of them, that particular novel, that casts a different light on what you might have thought if you just stopped at that point. I don't know if you're like me when you read. I read everything in a novel. I go to the back and I read what I can about the author if I haven't read anything by him or her before. I read the the beginning and see when it was published and who published it and how many versions of it have been printed, and I do all of that. And so I also read the afterword. What I've discovered is that a lot of people don't. People read the novel and they think the afterword is going to be something that really doesn't have anything to do with the novel, but that's not true. There's that is it's a lot of really interesting uh, fiction ends and doesn't complete until the afterward, and that was what I was trying to do.
Mhm.
And so when I began Love, Pride, and Murder, I think I mentioned that it was taken from a passage in Genesis, right? And again, this, I guess, theology enters into this as well, as at least Bible study, because I've always been fascinated by that story, 4:16 in Genesis, which is the Cain and Abel story. And on the surface and the story itself, you could draw all kinds of conclusions, but it's really just it's you know you can also gloss over the depth of that passage. There's a lot more to it than that, and we see it today just as readily as you might see it in that sort of classic form. Well, the second novel also borrows, and because that seemed to work out, even though I wasn't trying to expose anything in the scriptural passage. I wasn't trying to make it an allegory or anything like that. Um, it the ending, the afterword, sort of tied that idea together with the story. Okay, and it happens in such a way that the afterword isn't enough. It leads you down the path, but you're still not at the end. Okay, and that's where the trilogy will come in.
Yeah.
What I'm hoping is that the third afterword in the trilogy, will wrap all three of them up. And will it have a scriptural kind of conclusion? I think it'll have a human kind of conclusion that is reflected in scripture, or maybe vice versa. Okay.
Fantastic. want to ask you a question about the title itself. I wonder, is this conscious or subconscious little homage to Of Mice and Men? It's one of the few other titles I can think of that starts with of.
Well, again, not consciously,
Yeah.
that would be an honorable place to go.
Yeah.
Steinbeck is one of my favorite authors. Steinbeck is like the flip side of Hemingway. They were both writing at about the same time, and they're both Americans, and they both have a way of taking their own lives and expanding upon them, and then seeing what the country was all about, and then reflecting that in the writing. Hemingway came from a very different life, and he went in a lot of different places. Steinbeck, same way, and yet they're very different people. You know, Hemingway was sort of a macho man, I guess, to some reason. I never saw him that way, but I think that probably was the way he was viewed. Steinbeck was the sensitive kind of. Steinbeck would be the progressive. Hemingway would be the conservative, to give it, sort of. But yeah, Mice and Men was a great story, and it's one of those that you can dig all kinds of things from it. Uh, no, that wasn't conscious. Now, Towers and Shadows, again, go back to scripture, and it is a sort of rendering of, or at least a starting point of the Tower of Babel. Okay, so that's the tower, and Shadows has to do with the human understanding of what the tower is and
As
why,
always, you're amazing in your interpretations. I do appreciate that.
or just obscure. It's
Obscure is fun too. I want to thank you for being with us today. This has been so much fun. The book is Of Towers and Shadows, and we want to thank you for just doing everything you possibly can to bring this to more people. Thank you again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.